Some stigmas or common myths associated with kink is that we're all deviants. I mean, some of us are, don't get me wrong. I was going to say I identify as deviant, but it's not everybody. We're regular, everyday folks with professional, vanilla jobs. And when I say professional, I mean any type of job outside of what we do for play. We're normal students. There's really nothing different about us than we're pretty good at communicating. We're very open and honest with our sex life, and some of us enjoy a little bit of pain with our pleasure.
So there has always been a stigma around any kind of sex that is not inherently heterosexual, conventional sex between married people. So when we talk about kink and BDSM and the stigmas that are around that specifically, a lot of the misconceptions are around sex and thinking that BDSM and kink are inherently sexual, which they don't have to be inherently sexual. They can be, but they don't have to be. And so many of the myths and stigmas that we see are guided by a lot of things that the general population has seen, like 50 Shades of Grey or 365 on Netflix, and that's their ideology and conception of what BDSM and kink is. And so we see a man come into this space, and there's a woman in this power dynamic, and there's usually aggression and lust, and sometimes really hot sex. And so there's stigmas that typically come around power dynamic when it comes to BDSM and kink, and that's not generally always the case.
I would say, and I think probably as a therapist, and it's something I've been aware of prior to becoming a therapist, is that one of the myths is that in order for someone to be interested in kink, they have to have been abused, they have to come from a history of abuse or child abuse. And I would like to debunk that myth and say that there are people who have exquisite, amazing BDSM fantasies. They had them since they were young. It seems like for a lot of people it's just an orientation, just like a lot of our other orientations, where they have had that interest, have had like cool kinky thoughts since they were young, unrelated to any kind of abuse. There are people in the BDSM world who have suffered abuse, and that's pretty much true. But one of the things I was thinking about for this panel, and maybe we'll talk about it with the further questions, is about how people can heal from some of their childhood trauma through consensual participation in BDSM community and activities.
All right, perfect segue into our next question, which is how have you used BDSM or kink or seen others use it as a tool for processing and healing from trauma? And then the second part of that question is, how can kink or BDSM be empowering for folks with marginalized identities?
So I thought a lot about this question, and I realized I had a very lucky, privileged upbringing. I didn't have many experiences with trauma, but one way the BDSM and kink community still helped me was by providing me that social aspects, friends and my chosen family. They live across the country, and I know that I could call them in a heartbeat and they would be right there for me, in a heartbeat. And I think you mentioned this earlier, it brought me out of my shell. Typically I would not be up here talking to all you people, but being able to be self-confident and self-acceptance in myself through BDSM and kink has allowed me to do stuff like this. So, thank you.
So as someone who has previously had their consent taken from them non-consensually, this is why I do the things I do and why I'm in the spaces that I'm in. I love working with people who look like me, who are people of color, who are queer, people who have been sexually, mentally, emotionally assaulted, people with bigger bodies that are not typically in the scene, so that they have the ability of being in a space where they feel seen and heard and have the ability of actually taking up space. Something that I think is really amazing is that these types of spaces allow us to process feelings and emotions where at one point you were in an unsafe space to do so, and now you have the full autonomy to make that space safe for you. So you get to reclaim what was taken, even if it's ancestral. So even if you haven't experienced childhood trauma, you can still experience ancestral trauma that you then get to reclaim, and that it's in itself is powerful.
Cool, thanks. I probably should have taken notes, didn't. But yeah, I would say I would kind of echo what both of the other panelists have said, and just in addition to that, my mind's going a little blank, but having the ability, I think that the kink community, through how much active engagement there is around what activities we do, whether they're sexual or not, how much we process that with one another, I mean, especially within healthy dynamics, how much, yeah, just how much consent there is within that community, how much we talk about, are you into this? Are you not into this? Maybe could you be curious about this thing if XYZ were in place? And really getting to go through and really parse it out, right? It's not just, oh, we're in this like drunken, lusty rage and we're just doing the things, but we actually can like sit down as two sober individuals, or 3 or 4, however many, and say like, okay, this is a scene I'm interested in, and get to like plan it out together and say, you know, I've never done this, but I'd like to try. And also, here's a safe word, because maybe I wouldn't feel right in the middle. I might think that I'm gonna like it, and then I get there and I'm like, oh crap, this is too much for me. And there's always a way to like opt out. And I would say like that is some of the most empowering stuff, especially for people who've been survivors of any kind of abuse, or really anyone in our culture, because I'm assuming most of us in this room didn't have a comprehensive sex ed when we were young, and didn't get to learn about our bodies or activities we could do, especially with people with alternative bodies or alternative genders and sexualities, and having a space where like that's normal. That's what we do, is we have those conversations and we work that out and we figure out what really fun for everyone, and then get a chance to reevaluate afterwards and say, okay, that wasn't so fun, I'm not going to try something different next time. That's all like super empowering for all folks, really.
Great, thank you, Rafi. So I would love to hear from the other two of you about how you feel that consent comes up differently in a kink or BDSM context, and how that looks different than some other types of physical intimacy oftentimes, specifically in practice, not like how it should be. And then, you know, kind of expanding on your thoughts on how that dynamic can play into this healing aspect of engaging in BDSM and kink. And Rafi, if you have anything to add, you can also answer that, but I think you touched on that in your response there.
That's because he's already a therapist.
And he has a copy of the questions in front of him.
It's a natural segue.
Great, that's fine.
What was the question again?
I'm just going to read what I have written down because that was the thought out version of it. So in practice, how do you think consent in a BDSM or kink context looks different than in other types of physical or sexual intimacy? How do you think this plays a role in the processing and healing from trauma?
For me, consent, I've found actually takes longer in the BDSM and kink community. Like Rafi mentioned, we tend to sit down and plan our scenes. I've planned scenes over weeks and weeks just to make sure they operate correctly. And during that time, you're getting to know your partner. You're not just talking about sex, it's about understanding and being able to read their body reactions, little twitches in the eye, really getting to know that individual and what they're comfortable with. And for half the scenes that we do that for, they're not even about climax. They're simply about the enjoyment, the escape, the chance to process something. So consent without that intimacy is just a very open and honest, heartfelt conversation, I would say. I think you said this perfectly. you're able to take back that power. If you're working through a scene and it's all about consent, everything is about consent when you're dealing with these scenes, then yeah, you're able to take back your self-control, or be willing to give up that control to someone else. And that, I think, is an extremely freeing and powerful step in and of itself, realizing that you have no control, your senses may be taken away, you can't hear, can't see, can't breathe very well. Please do not partake in breath play by yourself, have someone trained with you. But yeah, like I said, you said it perfectly. Being able to take back that control and or giving all of yourself to that other person. And again, none of this is about sexual gratification necessarily. You're not necessarily doing this for an ultimate prize of being able to ejaculate at the end.
When we talk about processing or healing trauma, in every single scenario that trauma has occurred, there has been some form of autonomy that has been taken, whether that is the ability to communicate and their consent with full autonomy when it comes to their body. But in the process of this BDSM and kink space and talking through every single step of the way, we are enthusiastic yesing every single choice and decision that we are making, which then again is reclaiming what was taken that we didn't have the ability to communicate at that time. So I truly believe that consent is one of the biggest factors when it comes to healing and processing trauma in general, whether you're working with a therapist in an office, whether you are at a park and getting nature therapy, tattoo therapy, you are processing trauma, but by giving consent to whatever decision or action that you are making with it. So.
That actually has more to do with consent as it comes to therapy. I would say that what I learned about consent through the BDSM community has actually informed my clinical practice as a therapist. That like, we ask for consent even when we're like 99.9% sure the person's going to be into something. There's still like, you know, in a healthy situation, there's at least some amount of like, have we already talked about this? Do I already know you like this? I'm going to check in again just in case. I might check in the middle while you're experiencing it to be like, is this still good for you? And I would say as a therapist, like that's some of the stuff that I end up doing in my office too, well, my virtual office, is, you know, for example, a client might say like, they might mention that they experienced a trauma. And so I might say, would it feel okay if I asked you about that? And like wait for them to say yes. And then I will ask them about it and say, does it still feel okay for you to talk to me about this? And I actually had a client recently say that they were kind of amazed by it because they had had the experience of counselors who basically practiced like a no means no kind of consent. Meaning if they said no, they didn't want to share it, the counselor would say okay, but otherwise the counselor was going to ask the questions. And that they really appreciated that. Like, I wanted that enthusiastic consent. I wanted to know, yeah, they feel comfortable and ready to talk about this, and that there's no pressure to. They can talk about it another time. They can talk about it with somebody else. They never have to talk about it verbally with anyone, but they get to have that choice at all times.
Hopefully not speaking out of turn, I would like to just add a little bit, just in my thoughts, is also just kind of thinking about this in the context of trusting people and creating bonds that are trusting in ways that, is really different than in other situations, right? If you have somebody who's tying you up and wrapping ropes around your neck or your other body parts and stuff like that, it's really important that you have trust with that person, and being able to put that trust in another person, especially from my experiences in the past, both in sexual situations and otherwise, of people violating that trust, that can be really powerful in and of itself. Yeah. Cool. And I'm very pleased with how quickly we're moving through these questions, because there might be some time for audience questions, so get your thinking brains on. All right, cool. So our next question, kind of just talking about that experience and that relationship with the people who you're engaging in these scenes with and stuff like that. I'm wondering if y'all could tell us a little bit about what aftercare is, and what some examples of aftercare are that you've either used or seen used in like just in your general experience. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Aftercare is going to be different for everybody. For me personally, I like cuddling up on the couch with a movie, some food, and process the scene by myself, and then go back to the person that I was, or people that I was in that scene with, and kind of debrief together, see what they need, check in with them. Whether you're dominant or submissive in a scene, each person is going to need aftercare, regardless. It's a critical step just to make sure